June 4th, 1942, 8,000 feet above the endless blue of the Central Pacific, where the horizon blurred into a mocking infinity of waves and sky, the consolidated PBY-5 Catalina droned through the thin air like a wounded beast, its twin engines coughing against the relentless trade winds. You could feel the vibration in your bones, that deep, irregular thrum passing from the aluminum skin through the canvas-upholstered seats and into your spine. Lieutenant Commander John Ham Waldron gripped the control yoke tighter, his knuckles whitening under the strain. The cockpit smelled of stale coffee, sweat-soaked flight suits, and the faint, acrid tang of hydraulic fluid leaking from a strut. Outside, the sun beat down mercilessly, turning the greenhouse canopy into a sweltering oven. Beads of perspiration traced salty paths down Waldron's neck, soaking into the collar of his khaki shirt. "Still nothing, Skipper?" Ensign Ray Partial called from the navigator's station behind him, his voice barely cutting through the roar of the props. Partial was a wiry kid from Ohio, all elbows and optimism, hunched over a chart table cluttered with dividers, pencils, and a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in wax paper. The Catalina's interior was a labyrinth of wires, gauges, and jury-rigged equipment, radar sets that were more experimental than reliable. 50-caliber machine guns bolted to pintle mounts, and racks of 100-pound bombs that shifted uneasily with every gust. Waldron shook his head, eyes fixed on the featureless sea below. "Not a damn thing. But we're out here for a reason, Ray. Halsey's intel says the Jap fleet's somewhere in this godforsaken ocean. If we don't find 'em, nobody will." He adjusted the trim tabs, fighting the plane's natural tendency to wallow like a fat duck on a pond. The PBY wasn't built for speed, topping out at a leisurely 125 knots on a good day. But it could loiter for hours, its 2,500-mile range, a grudging gift from designers who'd prioritized endurance over elegance. Back at Pearl Harbor, the ground crews had ribbed them mercilessly. Flying garbage scows, they'd called these amphibians, with their bulbous hulls and fabric-covered wings that flapped like laundry in the breeze. Ugly, unreliable relics from the last war, fit only for ferrying VIPs or hunting submarines off the coast. But out here, in the vast emptiness where carriers decided empires, the Catalina was all the Navy had for long-range eyes. The crew of 6 moved like shadows in the dim fuselage. In the blister amidships, aviation radioman First Class Wes Van Horn peered through the drift sight, his binoculars sweeping the swells. The ocean was a restless giant today, whitecaps foaming under a sky dotted with cumulus clouds that offered fleeting shadows. Salt spray occasionally misted the windows, carried up by the prop wash. Van Horn's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but the cold seeping through his leather jacket. At this altitude, the air was crisp, biting at exposed skin, a stark contrast to the humid hell of the cockpit. "Contact bearing 270!" Van Horn shouted suddenly, his voice cracking with excitement. All eyes snapped to him. Waldron banked the plane gently to port, the Catalina responding with a sluggish grace, its pontoons glinting briefly in the sunlight before vanishing into the cloud deck below. You strain forward in your imaginary seat, heart pounding as the plane dips, the world tilting. The engines growl louder, props slicing the air with renewed urgency. Through the forward observation blister, the sea rushes closer, a mosaic of deep indigo and frothing white. Waldron's co-pilot, Lieutenant Jim Thatch, no relation to the famous fighter Ace, leans in, adjusting the throttle levers with gloved hands. "False alarm?" Thatch mutters, his breath fogging the glass. He's a veteran of the Philippines campaign, face lined with the weariness of a man who's seen too many empty dawns. Van Horn shakes his head, pressing the binoculars harder against his eyes. "No, sir. Smoke on the horizon. Thin, but it's there. Could be stacks." The radioman's fingers dance over the Morse key, tapping out the preliminary report to Midway. Enemy carriers sighted. But the signal fades in the static, the Pacific's vastness swallowing their words like so many pebbles in an abyss. Waldron pushed the nose down another 1,000 feet, the altimeter spinning lazily. The Catalina shuddered as it entered a layer of low stratus, moisture beading on the wings like sweat on a fevered brow. Inside, the temperature plummeted, and crewmen zipped up their flight jackets, breath visible in quick puffs. Partial cross-checked the position on his charts. Latitude 30° north, longitude 175° west, marking the grid with a grease pencil. If that's them, Skipper, we're 200 miles northwest of the atoll. Nagumo's birds could be airborne in minutes. The tension coiled like a spring. Waldron remembered the briefings at Ford Island. Admiral Nimitz's grim face under the fluorescent lights, maps pinned with red and blue flags. The Japanese had sortied from the home islands weeks ago, a massive armada aimed at Midway to lure the American fleet into a trap. Torpedo Squadron 8's Devastators had launched from Hornet that morning, but radio silence from the task force meant they were flying blind. The PBYs, derided as Dumbos by the hotshot fighter pilots, were the forgotten sentinels, patrolling in pairs from the atoll's lagoon. Waldron's bird, Black Cat's 14, had been airborne since 0430, fuel gauges dipping perilously low. Emerging from the clouds, the horizon sharpened. There, silhouetted against the glare, a cluster of masts, smoke trails rising like accusatory fingers. 4 carriers, escorts in tow, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy steaming at 25 knots toward annihilation. Waldron's pulse thundered in his ears. "It's them," he breathed, voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "All stations, prepare for low-level run. Bomb bay doors, stand by." The crew sprang into action. Gunners checked their mounts, the metallic clack of breeches echoing. Van Horn keyed the radio again, this time clearer. 4 carriers, 2 battleships, course 320, speed 25, position. Static crackled as a Japanese Zero streaked across their path, tracers arcing like fireworks. The Catalina lurched, a 20mm round punching through the wing, fabric tearing with a sharp rip. Alarms wailed, red lights flashing on the panel. You feel the jolt, the plane bucking like a spooked horse, the acrid smell of cordite filling the air. Waldron wrestles the controls, sweat stinging his eyes as Thatch calls out evasive maneuvers. "Dive to the deck, Skipper, use the waves." The altimeter unwinds. 5,000 feet, 3,000, 1,000. The sea rushing up to meet them. Bullets wind past, pinging off the hull. Van Horn returns fire from the dorsal turret, the .30 caliber barking in staccato bursts. They skim the waves at 50 feet, spray exploding against the windscreen, the carriers shrinking to specks astern. Waldron pulled up sharply, the G-forces pressing everyone into their seats. The message got through this time, faint but unbroken. The fleet located, coordinates locked. Back at Midway, alarms would blare, dauntless dive bombers scrambling to arms. But for now, in the cockpit of this mocked-out workhorse, Waldron allowed himself a grim smile. The PBY, ugly savior of the Pacific, had seen what no one else could. The war's tide was turning, one droning flight at a time. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the ocean, the crew settled into the long haul back. Fuel fumes mingled with the scent of victory. Bitter, hard-won. Partial logged the sighting, his pencil scratching steadily. Thatch wiped his brow, muttering, "Never thought I'd owe my life to a flying boat." Waldron nodded, eyes on the compass. Midway lay 700 miles southeast, a beacon in the dusk. They'd made it, against the odds, against the mockery. And in the days to come, the world would know why. The engines hummed on, carrying them home through the gathering night, the Pacific whispering secrets below. The Catalina's engines throbbed with a weary rhythm as darkness swallowed the horizon, the last slivers of sunset bleeding into the inky Pacific. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron eased back on the throttles, conserving what fuel remained in the tanks, gauges hovering just above bingo, that dreaded red line where hope turned to prayer. The cockpit lights were dimmed to a faint glow. casting elongated shadows across the instrument panel, where needles danced like fireflies in the night. You imagine yourself strapped into the jump seat behind Waldron, the chill of the cabin seeping through your Mae West life vest, the constant vibration numbing your fingers as you clutch the armrests. Salt crusted the edges of the windows, and every so often a rogue wave's spray slapped against the hull, a reminder of the ocean's unyielding grasp just 50 feet below. Ensign Ray Partial hunched over his charts in the navigator's nook, the red-filtered flashlight painting his face in bloody hues. His pencil scratched furiously, plotting the reciprocal course, southeast by east, 120 degrees true, adjusting for the crosswind that gusted from the northwest at 15 knots. "We've got about 4 hours till touchdown, Skipper," he said, voice low to avoid startling the crew. "Wind's pushing us a bit off, but we'll make the lagoon by 200 if the props hold." Partial's optimism had frayed at the edges. The earlier dogfight with that Zero had left a jagged scar on his confidence, and he kept glancing at the patched wing fabric fluttering outside. Waldron nodded, his eyes heavy-lidded but alert, scanning the void ahead. The adrenaline from the sighting had ebbed, leaving a hollow ache in his chest. "Good work on the fix, Ray. That message better have punched through. Nimitz needs those coordinates like yesterday." He reached for the thermos wedged between the seats, pouring a lukewarm swig of coffee that tasted of rust and regret. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Jim Thatch, stirred beside him, rubbing circulation back into his legs. Thatch's hands, still gloved against the cold, fiddled with the radio dials, static hissing like distant surf. "Pearl's acknowledging fragments, sir, but the full report, it's spotty. Japs must be jamming." In the aft compartment, aviation radioman First Class Wes Van Horn nursed a shallow cut on his forehead from the turret's recoil, a 20mm fragment that had whined too close. The blister's dome was fogged with his breath, and he wiped it clear with a rag stained by gun oil. The machine guns were silent now, their barrels cooling in the draft, but the acrid scent of spent powder lingered, mixing with the ever-present odor of diesel exhaust. Van Horn keyed the transmitter intermittently, sending position pings to Midway's tower. Black Cat's 14 en route, ETA 0200, fuel critical. The Morse clicked out in precise dots and dashes, a lifeline across the miles. The crew settled into the monotony of the return leg, a fragile camaraderie born of shared peril. Seaman First Class Tommy Ruiz, the ordnance man, checked the bomb racks, empty now. Their 100-pounders unneeded in the frantic pass. He munched on a saltine from his ration kit, crumbs scattering on the deck amid coils of antenna wire. "That was some luck, huh?" Ruiz muttered to no one in particular, his Brooklyn accent thick with fatigue. "Spotting Nagumo's birds like they were parked for tea." The others grunted in agreement, but no one laughed. Luck had a way of curdling in this war. As the hours dragged, the Catalina pierced a bank of high cirrus, the moon emerging like a silver coin to illuminate the swells below. Waldron's mind wandered to the briefings, the maps unrolled on Midway's scarred coral tables. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's task force, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, lurking north of the atoll, their Dauntlesses and Avengers primed for payback after Pearl Harbor's inferno. The PBYs had been the eyes, the unglamorous scouts dismissed by the carrier jocks as flying elephants or worse. Waldron remembered the jeers at Ford Island, pilots in crisp flight jackets mocking the Catalina's lumbering takeoffs from the lagoon, their hulls slapping the water like reluctant porpoises. "Why bother with those relics?" one ace had sneered. "Send up the Wildcats, they'll spot 'em faster." But speed meant nothing in this endless blue. Endurance was the silent killer, the PBY's 14-hour loiter turning the tide. A sudden jolt snapped everyone alert. The plane hit turbulence, wings flexing with a groan of struts. You feel it in your gut, that stomach-lurching drop as the altimeter flickers, the ocean surging closer in the moonlight. Thatch gripped the yoke with Waldron, stabilizing the beast. "Rotor from that squall line ahead," he said, pointing to the radar scope's faint echo. The experimental set, a bulky ASR unit jury-rigged from British designs, painted green blobs on the screen. Clouds, not contacts, thank God. No more zeros tonight. The Japanese wouldn't waste fighters on a retreating scout. Marshall called out course corrections, his voice steadying the mood. Bearing 135 now, distance to Midway 250 miles. Outside, bioluminescent plankton trailed the waves like ghost lights, an ethereal counterpoint to the war machines above. Van Horn tuned the ADF receiver, Midway's beacon pulsing faintly. Dit-da-dit, the international Morse for M, home. The radio man allowed himself a sigh, leaning back against the bulkhead. "Think the dive bombers got 'em, Skipper, after our wire?" Waldron's jaw tightened. "If they did, it's because of us. Ugly or not, this bird earned her keep today." He thought of the carriers they'd glimpsed. Akagi's pagoda mast, stark against the smoke. Kaga's deck swarming with Zeros like angry wasps. The report had painted the picture. 4 flatstops, screened by cruisers and destroyers, barreling toward the atoll at flank speed. By now the alarm at Midway would be blaring. Ground crews swarming the revetments, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon's Marines hunkering in their pillboxes. And out there in the black, Fletcher's birds would be airborne, guided by Black Cat's 14's eyes. The first hints of dawn grayed the eastern sky as the lagoon came into view, a dark smudge fringed by palm silhouettes. Waldron retarded the mixtures, the engines sputtering in protest as he lined up for the water landing. The Catalina descended, hull kissing the swells with a series of jolts that sprayed foam across the windscreen. You brace as the plane settles, pontoons digging in, the roar fading to a gurgle. The thatch deployed the sea anchors, canvas bags plopping into the waves to halt their drift. Cheers erupted from the crew, muted, exhausted, as the bow swung toward the channel buoys. Tugs from Henderson Field met them at Aero 150, lines snaking out in the pre-dawn chill. Waldron climbed onto the step, boots sloshing in the shallows, and saluted the deck officer waiting on the motor launch. "Sighted the main body," he reported, voice hoarse. "Coordinates in the log. They know now." The officer's face lit with grim relief, radioing it up the chain. As the crew disembarked, legs wobbling on the coral pier, the first roars of engines echoed from the airstrip, Dauntlesses taxiing out, their radial engines bellowing defiance. Word spread like wildfire through the atoll's bunkers. The PBYs had found them. Mocked no more, the Catalinas were legends in the making. But as Waldron watched the dawn patrol lift off, silhouettes against the paling sky, he knew the real fight was just beginning. The Pacific stretched endless, hungry for more sightings, more risks, and in the hangars, ground crews already prepped the next Black Cat for patrol. Ugly, reliable, indispensable. The sun crested fully now, gilding the lagoon in gold as the base buzzed to life. Victory hung in the balance, one droning flight from certainty. June 4th, 1942. 06:30 hours. Henderson Field, Midway Atoll, where the coral dust swirled like talcum powder under the taxiing props of SBD Dauntless dive bombers. The air thrummed with the guttural roar of Pratt & Whitney radials firing up, a symphony of raw power that shook the ground and rattled the corrugated metal Quonset huts. You stand there on the revetment's edge, squinting against the low sun's glare, the heat already baking the tarmac as if the Pacific itself were exhaling fire. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron wiped the salt crust from his flight jacket, his boots sinking into the soft coral as he watched the ground crews swarm like ants. Men in sweat-drenched dungarees chocked wheels, fueled tanks with 100 octane from rumbling trucks, and loaded the bomb shackles with 1,000-pounders that dangled like iron pendulums beneath the Dauntlesses' bellies. The scent of aviation gas hung heavy, mingling with the sharper bite of cordite from test-fired guns and the ever-present brine from the lagoon lapping nearby. Waldron's report had ignited the base an hour ago, the teletype clattering in the operations tent like machine gun fire. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, his face a mask of calculated calm under the brim of his peaked cap, had paced the sandbagged command post, maps unrolled across a folding table scarred by cigarette burns. "Waldron's birds nailed it," he'd said, voice gravelly, from chain-smoking Luckies. "Nagumo's carriers at 320 degrees, 200 miles out. Launch the strike. Yorktown's group first." Now the flight line was chaos incarnate. Pilots in yellow May Wests and helmets climbing into cockpits, throttles advanced in unison, sending plumes of blue exhaust curling skyward. Ensign Ray Partial clapped Waldron on the shoulder, his eyes bloodshot from the night's vigil. "Our sighting, Skipper. Those devastators from Hornet are already up. Thatch says they're vectoring on your cords." Partial's hand still trembled slightly as he lit a Chesterfield, the match flaring bright against the dawn. From the PBY hangar, aviation radio man Wes Van Horn emerged, bandaged forehead stark white, carrying a dented thermos. "Pearl's confirming, sir. Nimitz is rerouting Enterprise's air group. The Japs won't know what hit 'em." Van Horn's voice carried an edge of vindication. Back in the States, they'd laughed at the Catalinas, slow, ugly amphibians that couldn't dogfight a seagull. But today, Black Cat's 14's endurance had bought the fleet its eyes. Across the field, Lieutenant Richard Best, Yorktown's bombing 6, strapped into his SBD-3, the dive brakes folding out with a hydraulic whine. Best was a precision man, Annapolis 32, with a cool demeanor that masked the fire in his gut from Pearl Harbor's ashes. His gunner, Chief Radio Man James Murray, hunched in the rear cockpit, testing the .30 caliber twin mount, the barrel swinging smoothly on its pivot. "Clear skies ahead, Lieutenant," Murray called over the intercom, his Texas drawl cutting through the engine noise. "Waldron's fix puts 'em right in our lap, Akagi leading the pack." Best nodded, visor down, as the chocks were pulled away. The Dauntless shuddered forward, tail rising in a slow pivot, props blurring into silver discs. You feel the ground quiver underfoot as the first wave taxied, the collective roar building to a crescendo that drowned out the distant surf. Waldron shielded his eyes, watching the dive bombers lift off in echelon, undercarriages retracting with metallic clunks. 10 from Yorktown, led by Best, climbing to 15,000 feet in a tightening formation, contrails feathering behind like comet tails. The air was alive with the tang of oil and rubber, palm fronds rattling in the prop wash. Fletcher's voice crackled over the field phone from the Yorktown, relayed to the tower. "Strike away! Godspeed!" The Admiral stood on the carrier's bridge 150 miles east, binoculars trained westward, his Chief of Staff, Captain Elliot Buckmaster, murmuring updates from the CIC. Aboard the lead Dauntless, Best leveled off at Angels 12, the Pacific a glittering expanse below, dotted with the atoll sandbars shrinking to specks. The formation droned northwest, airspeed steady at 140 knots, the wind whistling through the open dive flap. Murray keyed the radio, voice steady. "Yorktown strike position check, bearing 310, climbing through 10,000. Static hissed back from the task force. But the vector held true, Waldron's coordinates etched in every pilot's kneeboard. Best's mind raced through the drill. Approach high, spot the carrier's wakes like white scars on the blue, then push over into that heart-stopping 70-degree dive, sights locked on the deck. Back on Midway, the PBY crews refueled their birds under floodlights that buzzed like angry hornets. Lieutenant Jim Thatch, Waldron's co-pilot, helped the mechanics patch the bullet holes in Black Cat's 14's wing. Dope and fabric stretched taut over the frame. "She took a licking but kept ticking," Thatch said, wiping grease from his hands on a rag. Waldron grunted agreement, staring at the sky where the Dauntlesses had vanished. Seaman Tommy Ruiz slung ammo cans from the armory, his muscles aching from the night's tension. "If Best nails 'em, those flyboys will finally shut up about our garbage scows." Laughter rippled through the ground pounders, a brief release amid the urgency. Hours stretched as the sun climbed, turning the lagoon into a mirror of molten silver. In the ops tent, radiomen clustered around the sets, headphones clamped on, transcribing fragments. "Enemy cap heavy, Zeros at 3 o'clock high. Waldron paced outside, coffee mug steaming in the humid air, the coral crunching under his pacing boots. Partial joined him, charts under arm. Fletcher's holding Enterprise in reserve, Spruance's call. If the first strike misses, we're the backup eyes again. The weight of it settled like humidity on their shoulders. The PBYs, with their 20-hour legs, were the only ones who could loiter out there if Nagumo turned tail. At 10:15, the radio erupted. Best's voice, strained but triumphant. "Bombs away! Direct hit on Akagi! Fires amidships!" Cheers exploded across the field, fists pumping as the report painted the scene, Dauntlesses screaming down through flak bursts, 1,000-pounders plunging like thunderbolts, secondary explosions blooming orange on the carrier decks. Kaga took two, her flight deck crumpling like tin foil, Zeros caught on the hangar deck, erupting in chain reaction fireballs. Soryu listed, smoke billowing black as oil slicks ignited on the sea. You lean into the broadcast, pulse racing with the pilots, imagining the G-forces in that plunge, the world inverting, wind howling, the carrier rushing up like a fatal embrace. Best pulled out at 1,500 feet, his plane riddled but airborne, Murray spraying tracers at pursuing Claudes. "Yorktown strike RTB," he transmitted, the words crackling through the ether to Midway's antennas. By noon, the base was electric. Marines in the pillboxes scanning the horizon, PT boats churning from the lagoon, ready for any counterstrike. Waldron clasped Van Horn's hand as the first damaged Dauntlesses splashed down, crews paddling to the buoys. "We saw 'em first," Waldron said simply, voice thick. The mockery from Pearl Harbor faded like yesterday's headlines. The Catalina, derided as the Navy's ugly stepchild, had pierced the veil no radar or faster scout could match. Nagumo's fleet reeled, the wolf pack of carriers gutted in minutes, all thanks to one droning patrol in the endless blue. As the afternoon haze thickened, more reports filtered in. Hiryu counterattacked, but Yorktown burned under her fury. Yet the tide had turned. Midway held, the Japanese advance shattered. Waldron watched another PBY taxi out, engines belching smoke, bound for afternoon sweeps. The war ground on. But in this atoll's sweltering heart, the worst Recon plane had become legend, its wings carrying the Allies one step closer to victory. The Pacific whispered on, secrets unfolding under the relentless sun. June 4th, 1942, 1400 hours. Aboard USS Yorktown, slicing through the swells 150 miles northeast of Midway Atoll, where the deck tilted gently under a sky bruised with anvil-headed cumulus. The carrier's island superstructure hummed with urgency, radar antennas sweeping the horizon like vigilant sentinels, their parabolic dishes rotating with a low electric whine. You stand on the gallery deck, gripping the salt-crusted railing, the wind whipping your flight jacket as the Yorktown steamed at 27 knots, her screws churning white foam in the wake. The air carried the sharp tang of welding torches from damage control parties patching the forward flight deck, where earlier near misses from Japanese Val dive bombers had scorched the teak planking black. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher paced the bridge, his binoculars slung around his neck, face etched with the strain of command. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the fans whirring overhead, circulating air thick with the smell of coffee grounds and unwashed uniforms. "Spruance's taking the lead now," he muttered to Captain Elliot Buckmaster, his chief of staff, who nodded grimly while plotting vectors on the chart table. Yorktown's air group had drawn first blood that morning. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu gutted by Best's Dauntlesses. But Hiryu, the last of Nagumo's carriers, had slipped the noose, her scouts circling like vultures. In the Combat Information Center below decks, Lieutenant Commander John Crommelin hunched over the CXIM radar repeater, green phosphor traces flickering across the scope. The CIC was a steel womb lit by red battle lamps, the air stale with cigarette smoke and the ozone bite of vacuum tubes. "Bogies at 220, Angels 15,000, about 20 strong," Crommelin called out. his voice cutting through the murmur of plotters sliding grease pencils over plexiglass sheets. The room tensed, phones jangling as the word rocketed up, Japanese counter-strike inbound, Vals and Kates from Hiryu, vectored by a lucky floatplane spotter who'd evaded the cap. Fletcher's decision to hold Enterprise and Hornet in reserve had bought time, but now Yorktown steamed alone, her fighters scrambling, 12 Wildcats clawing into the sky from the elevators, pilots like Lieutenant Wally Peterson snapping salutes to the LSO before throttling up. Up on the flight deck, aviation machinist's mate second class Eddie Gallagher wrestled with the catapult shuttle, his hands black with grease as he armed the hydraulic rams. The deck crew in coloured jerseys, yellow for shooters, green for hook runners, scurried like beetles, folding wings with a clatter of struts and pins. The Yorktown shuddered as the first F4F vaulted off the bow, props howling, leaving a trail of rubber smoke. You feel the deck buck beneath you, the carrier's grey hull groaning against the Sea State 3 chop, spray misting your goggles. Gallagher wiped his brow, yelling over the din to his buddy, Plane Captain Mike Rossi. "Those Zeros from here you'll be on us like flies if our boys don't thin 'em." Rossi, a wiry Italian from Brooklyn, nodded, stowing a toolbox amid the arresting wires that snaked like veins across the planking. Aboard one of the patrolling PBYs, Black Cat's 22, airborne since noon from Midway's lagoon, Lieutenant Howard Howie Penrose banked his Catalina through a veil of trade winds, the fabric wings flexing with each thermal updraft. At 8,000 feet, the world was a patchwork of azure and cumulus shadows, the ocean below a restless mosaic veined with whitecaps. Penrose's cockpit reeked of peanut butter sandwiches and the faint fishy odour from the hull's bilges, where water sloshed from the morning's rough takeoff. His co-pilot, Ensign Bill McVeigh, adjusted the Yagi antenna for the radar set, its dials glowing dimly. "Still no joy on Hiryu, Skipper," McVeigh said, peering through the greenhouse canopy smeared with oil streaks. The PBY's endurance was a double-edged sword, loitering for 12 hours on 1,200 gallons of fuel, but the experimental SCR-271 radar painted only ghosts today, ionospheric interference fuzzing the returns. In the waste blister, Radio Man Second Class, Frank Kowalski swept binoculars across the bearing, his leather helmet chafing his neck. The crew of 7 moved with practiced rhythm, Ordnance man checking the depth charges that rattled in their racks, gunners oiling the twin. 50 cals on the nose turret. Kowalski's fingers itched on the Morse key, tapping updates to Midway. Patrol sector Echo, no contact, fuel 60%. But then, a glint on the water, 80 miles west, a carrier's wake, arrow straight, screened by picket destroyers. "Smoke trail, bearing 245, that's her! Hear you!" Kowalski shouted, voice cracking. Penrose snapped the plane into a turn, the Catalina wallowing left, altimeter unwinding as they descended for confirmation. The props thrummed louder, vibrating through the spars, while McVeigh keyed the radio. Enemy carrier sighted, position 2810N, 17730W, course 090, speed 20. Back on Yorktown, the alarm klaxons wailed, a piercing 2-note howl that sent sailors bolting to stations. Fletcher gripped the Polaris, eyes on the approaching storm front that masked the raiders. "All hands to general quarters," Buckmaster ordered over the 1MC, the words booming through every compartment. Anti-aircraft crews swarmed the sponsons, 1.1-inch pom-poms and 20mm Ehrlichons manned, their breeches clacking open. You dashed down the companionway with the damage control team, boots pounding grated steel, the ship heeling as she turned into the wind to launch more fighters. The Wildcats tangled with the leading Zeros 40 miles out, tracers stitching the sky like fiery seams, but the valves broke through, sirens screaming as they peeled into dives. The first bomb struck at 14:25, a 550-pounder, slamming the flight deck amidships, erupting in a geyser of flame and twisted metal. Yorktown lurched, bulkheads buckling with a thunderous crack, fire mains rupturing in showers of foam. Gallagher was thrown against a bulkhead, ears ringing, tasting blood from a split lip as he scrambled up, grabbing a hose nozzle. "Flood it! "Flood the bastards!" he yelled, water blasting from the saltwater pumps, hissing against the inferno that clawed at the hangar deck. Planes caught fire, 2 Avengers blooming into orange fireballs, their torpedoes cooking off with muffled booms. Rossi hauled a wounded pilot from the wreckage, the man's flight suit charred, screams lost in the chaos. Penrose's PBY circled high, evading a Zero's burst that shredded a float strut, fabric fluttering like confetti. "Message out. Hear you's launching," McVeigh transmitted, the dots and dashes racing to Fletcher's CIC. The coordinates would guide the afternoon counterstrike from Enterprise, McCluskey's Dauntlesses already fueling on her deck. Below, Yorktown burned, listing to port, her bow dipping as counter-flooding teams raced against the tilt. Fletcher, steady as granite, ordered abandon ship preparations, but not before the cruiser's radars confirmed the PBY's fix. Here you exposed, ripe for the kill. As the sun slanted westward, casting long shadows over the smoke pool, Kowalski logged the sighting, pencil trembling. The Catalina droned on, a lone eye in the vast blue, its mocked frame once again piercing the fog of war. Yorktown fought on, listing but unbowed, while the Pacific churned with the echoes of battle, traces fading, sirens silent, the tide inexorably shifting under the relentless gaze of the worst recon plane. June 4th, 1942, 15:30 hours. Aboard USS Enterprise, churning northwest at 25 knots through a sea whipped by afternoon squalls, 200 miles from the burning hulk of Yorktown. The carrier's hangar deck echoed with the frantic clatter of tools and shouted orders, the air thick with the acrid bite of hydraulic fluid and the oily reek of warmed Pratt & Whitney engines. You brace against a bulkhead in the ready room, the deck vibrating under your feet as the ship heaves into the building swells, spray sheeting over the sponsons like cold rain. Lieutenant Clarence McCluskey, Air Group Commander, his Annapolis ring glinting under the overhead bulbs, scanned the blackboard where grease pencil scribbles marked vectors and fuel states. His pilots, 18 Dauntlesses from VB6 and VS6, lounged in wicker chairs, flight suits unzipped, nursing lukewarm coffee from tin mugs stamped with the ship's crest. The room smelled of sweat and stale tobacco, fans whirring futilely against the humid press of bodies. McCluskey's voice cut through the murmur. "Penrose's PBY just fixed, hear you. 2810 north, 17730 west, steaming east at 20 knots. She's launching, but we're the hammer. Dive low on the escorts if you have to, but nail that deck." Outside, on the flight deck slick with Pacific mist, Aviation Ordnanceman First Class Hank Kowalski, no relation to the PBY radio man, hoisted a 500-pound bomb onto the bomb cart, its olive-drab casing thudding against the teak planking. The wind tugged at his dungarees, carrying the distant thunder of Yorktown's fires, visible as a smudge on the horizon through breaks in the clouds. Ground crews in blue jerseys swarmed the SBD-3s, arming the bomb shackles with hydraulic clunks, while shooters tested the 50-caliber wing guns, breeches cycling empty with sharp snaps. Ensign George Gay, the lone survivor from Torpedo Squadron 8's doomed devastators earlier that day, leaned against a stack of life rafts, his flight jacket torn and salt-crusted, eyes hollow from the massacre off Hornet. "Those Catalinas did it again," he muttered to a passing deckhand, voice raw. "Spotted what our torps died for. Ugly sons of bitches, but they see through the damn fog." Admiral Raymond Spruant stood on the bridge, his slight frame rigid against the teak rail, binoculars trained on the anvil clouds massing to the west. Captain Miles Browning, Enterprise's air operations officer, hovered nearby, plotting the strike on the chart table, dividers scratching across the acetate overlay. "McCluskey's group airborne in 5, sir," Browning said, his cigar clenched between teeth yellowed by endless watches. "No radar fix from our CXIM, too much interference, but that PBY's cords are gold. Hiryu's the last one standing, sinker, and Nagumo's done." Spruance nodded curtly, the wind ruffling his khaki collar, the taste of salt on his lips from the spray. Below, in the CIC, plotters tracked the inbound bogies from Hiryu, Val's peeling off after mauling Yorktown. But Enterprise's Wildcats had intercepted most, the sky 50 miles out, a fading fireworks of tracers and parachutes. At 1600, McCluskey led the Dauntlesses off the deck, the first SBD vaulting the bow with a roar that shook the island structure, arresting wires humming in release. You feel the thrust as if strapped in, the G-pull pressing you back, the ocean dropping away in a rush of blue and white. Lieutenant Edgar Stebbins in the slot position followed, his gunner, aviation radio man third-class Paul Tex Landry, scanning the rear-view periscope for bandits. The formation climbed to 12,000 feet through scattered virga, ice crystals flecking the canopies, the air crisp and biting at exposed skin. McCluskey's voice crackled over the RTF. CAG to strike, heading 240 magnetic airspeed 135. Watch for cap. Those zeros are thick as flies. The pilots adjusted trim tabs, the dive brakes folding with faint whines, while below, the Pacific scrolled like a newsreel, islands of cloud casting racing shadows. Aboard Black Cat's 22, Lieutenant Howard Penrose nursed his damaged Catalina at 10,000 feet, circling 40 miles astern of Hiryu to maintain visual. The float strut's tear fluttered in the slipstream, a constant worry. But the engines purred steadily on their radial Wasp power plants, fuel sipping at a conservative 40 gallons per hour. Ensign Bill McVeigh mopped sweat from his brow in the co-pilot's seat, the greenhouse fogging with their breaths. Enterprise's strike should be on station in 20, Skipper, he said, cross-checking the chronometer against the DR position. The radio man, Frank Kowalski, tapped urgent updates. Hiryu position update, bearing 090 from previous, smoke visible, deck activity high. Static crackled as a Zero patrol buzzed distant, but the PBY's low silhouette against the waves kept them hidden, for now. In the blister, the bowgun appeared through salt-streaked glass, the carrier's pagoda mast a stark silhouette 30 miles off, her deck alive with frantic figures fueling Aichi Vals amid rising black smoke from auxiliary fires. The Dauntlesses bored through the overcast, emerging at 16:55 into a sky torn by searchlights from Japanese cruisers, Tone and Chikuma, their 8-inch guns traversing skyward. McCluskey spotted the wake first, a mile-long arrow of foam, Hiryu's island wreathed in flak bursts. "Tally-ho! Carriers dead ahead! Push over!" he barked. You plummet with them, stomach flipping in the 80-degree dive, wind screaming past the cockpit as the altimeter spins wildly, 10,000, 6,000, 3,000 feet. Stebbins lined up on the forward deck, crosshairs steady on the elevator pit, while Landry sprayed the escorts with his 30 cal, brass cartridges tinkling into the slipstream. Zeros swarmed, 20mm rounds punching holes in wings, but the Dauntlesses held formation, bomb releases whistling like banshees. The first 500-pounder struck at 1700, crumpling Hiryu's flight deck in a blossom of fire and steel, the explosion's roar carrying across the water like Judgment Day. Secondary blasts ripped through the hangar. Torpedoes and bombs detonating in chain reaction, orange fireballs erupting skyward. McCluskey's own bomb glanced off, but Lieutenant Bruce Harbert's plunged true amidships, flooding the engine rooms in a gush of steam. The carrier heeled, listing 15 degrees, her crew abandoning anti-aircraft mounts to battle the inferno. 4 more hits followed, the sea boiling around her as destroyers closed to screen, their 5 inches barking futilely. Penrose's PBY witnessed it all from afar, the fireball lighting the horizon like a false dawn. "Strike successful. Hiryu afire, dead in water," Kowalski transmitted, the Morse clicking triumphantly to Enterprise's antennas. The Catalina banked away, props hauling through the dusk, evading a parting shot from a cruiser that sent shrapnel pinging off the hull. Back on Enterprise, cheers erupted in the ready room as McCluskey's voice confirmed, Splash 1 carrier, here you's done, RTB. Spruance allowed a tight smile on the bridge, the tension easing like a released breath, while deck crews readied the arresters for the returning birds, riddled but victorious. As twilight deepened, painting the waves in bruised purples, Yorktown's survivors were plucked from the sea by destroyers, her fires a dying glow. The PBYs, those mocked sentinels, had threaded the needle again, spotting the elusive fourth carrier when radars failed and fighters flew blind. McCluskey's planes splashed down at 1900, hooks snagging wires with squeals of rubber, pilots climbing out to backslaps and cold cokes. Gay watched from the deck, nodding to a passing airman. Tell Waldron and Penrose their garbage scow just won the battle. The Enterprise steamed south under gathering stars, the Pacific quieting, Nagumo's armada shattered, 4 carriers sunk, the myth of Japanese invincibility cracked wide open. But in the hangars, as mechanics patched the Catalinas under arc lights buzzing like fireflies, the crews knew the cost. Yorktown scuttled at dawn, her brave hulk consigned to the depths. The worst Recon plane had peered into the abyss and pulled victory from it, one endurance flight at a time, the war's endless blue yielding to Allied steel. June 5th, 1942, 0800 hours. Midway Atoll's Henderson Field, where the morning sun scorched the coral airstrip into a blinding white haze, and the air hung heavy with the stench of smouldering avgas and charred palm fronds. The lagoon lapped lazily against the seaplane ramp, its turquoise waters flecked with debris from the night's frenzy, empty shell casings bobbing like driftwood, oil slicks iridescent under the light. You kneel on the crushed coral edge, fingers sifting through the warm grit, the distant rumble of a patrolling PBY's engines vibrating through the ground like a fading heartbeat. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron stood nearby, his flight jacket slung over one shoulder, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms tanned and scarred from endless patrols. He lit a lucky strike, the match flaring briefly against his stubbled jaw, inhaling deeply as if to draw in the fragile peace. The base was a hive of weary activity. Marines in sweat-soaked utilities stacking sandbags around the revetments, their M1 rifles slung low, while ground crews towed bullet-riddled dauntlesses into hangars, wings drooping like wounded birds. The acrid tang of burnt rubber mingled with the salty breeze, and every so often a radio speaker crackled from the ops tent, spitting fragments of triumph. "Nagumo withdrawing! 4 carriers confirmed sunk." Ensign Ray Partial emerged from the Quonset hut, clutching a sheaf of teletype flimsies, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, but alight with something fiercer, vindication. Skipper Pearl's buzzing, Nimitz himself sent the wire. PBY sightings pivotal, Black Cats turned the key. Partial's voice carried over the hum of a generator chugging nearby, its exhaust belching black smoke that curled toward the palms. He handed Waldron the sheet, the ink still fresh, words praising the Catalina's unparalleled endurance that had pierced the Japanese screen when CXAM radars painted only static and Wildcats flew too fast to loiter. Waldron scanned it, a rare grin cracking his face, then passed it to aviation radioman Wes Van Horn, who leaned against a toolbox, bandaging a fresh blister on his hand from the Morse key's relentless chatter. Van Horn chuckled, a dry rasp. From flying garbage scows to saviors in 24 hours, those carrier jocks in Pearl choke on their cigars. He nodded toward the lagoon, where Black Cat's 14 bobbed gently, her patched hull riding the swells, mechanics sloshing through knee-deep water to inspect the props. The PBY's bulbous lines, once the butt of jokes, Dumbos that wallowed like drunk ducks, now gleamed with purpose under the sun, her twin R1830 engines silent but ready, fuel hoses snaking from the pier like umbilical cords. Lieutenant Jim Thatch waded out to her, clipboard in hand, calling orders to Seaman Tommy Ruiz, who hauled a crate of 50 cal ammo belts, muscles straining under the weight. "She took 3 hits yesterday and still brought us home," Thatch shouted back, slapping the hull with affection. The fabric patches over the bullet holes puckered slightly in the breeze, a testament to the night's hasty repairs under Klieg lights that had hummed like angry wasps. Across the field, Admiral Chester Nimitz's staff huddled in the command bunker, maps unrolled on a table slick with condensation from the humid air. Nimitz, his white hair tousled by the trade winds filtering through the sandbagged slits, traced the retreat vectors with a pencil. Nagumo's remnants limping southwest, cruisers screening the battered battleships, submarines shadowing like ghosts. "The PBYs gave us the edge," he said to his intelligence officer, Captain Layton, whose face was gaunt from decoding the scraps of Japanese traffic. "Without Waldron and Penrose's eyes, we'd be chasing shadows. Endurance over speed, that's the lesson." Layton nodded, flipping through logs. Black Cat's 14's initial sighting at 0700 yesterday, Penrose's fix on Hear You at 1400, each transmission a lifeline that vectored McCluskey's fatal dive. The room smelled of mildew and stale coffee, typewriters clacking as aides transcribed the after-action reports, the Pacific's vastness reduced to grid squares on paper. You wander toward the pier, boots sinking into the soft sand, the sun baking your neck as a destroyer. USS Hammond steamed into the channel, her deck crowded with Yorktown survivors, faces hollow and salt-encrusted. Lieutenant Richard Best, arm in a sling from flak shrapnel, spotted Waldron and limped over, gripping his hand firmly. "Your bird saw what ours couldn't, Commander. That low loiter, it's what let us drop the hammer on Akagi." Best's voice was hoarse, laced with the smoke he'd inhaled pulling out of his dive, but his eyes held respect, the old rivalry dissolved in shared victory. Waldron shrugged it off, but inside, the weight lifted. The jeers from Ford Island. "Why send the elephants when we have fighters?" faded like echoes in the surf. Behind them, Ensign George Gay from Torpedo 8 sat on a crate, nursing a bandaged leg, his Devastator lost in the morning mist. "We flew blind till your wire hit," he said quietly. "Owe you flyboys the beers if we ever get shore leave." As noon approached, the base stirred with the next patrol. Another Catalina, Black Cat's 19, taxied from the ramp, hull slapping the waves before lifting off in a spray of foam, her props churning to a steady drone. Lieutenant Howard Penrose, fresh from his Hear You fix, climbed aboard a jeep bound for debrief, his co-pilot Bill McVeigh tossing him a canteen. "One battle down, Skipper, but the Japs'll be back. Guadalcanal whispers already." Penrose nodded, the wind ruffling his hair, the horizon a mocking infinity of blue that had nearly swallowed them whole. In the distance, Enterprise's mast pierced the haze, Spruance's task force coalescing for the counter-offensive, radars sweeping but still reliant on those unglamorous scouts. Word rippled through the fleet via radioman's keys. The Catalinas, derided as relics unfit for the modern war, had shortened the Pacific grind by months, their sightings unraveling Nagumo's trap and shattering the carrier myth. Back in Washington, admirals pored over photos, smoke plumes from sunken decks, crediting the PBY's 2,500-mile wings with tipping the scales. Waldron watched the departing patrol plane climb, silhouetted against the cumulus towers building offshore, and felt the shift. No more mockery, only quiet awe. The worst recon plane had become the Navy's unseen sword, piercing veils no other could, from Midway's atoll to the war's endless reaches. By evening, as the sun dipped into a blood-orange sea, the crews gathered around a makeshift fire pit, flames crackling on driftwood, sharing rations of spam and hardtack. Laughter mingled with the surf's sigh, stories of the sightings exchanged like talismans. Van Horn raised his mug, warm beer from a salvaged crate, toasting, "To the Dumbos that flew us to dawn." The Pacific stretched dark and vast, but for the first time, its secrets felt conquerable, one droning endurance flight at a time. The war machine ground on, fueled by the eyes of the mocked, the tide inexorably turning under their watchful gaze.